Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in about a minute and a half, just to make sure we have enough time for everybody to join us. Folks are starting to roll in, but you know how it goes. We don't want to get started too soon. So take that last sip of coffee, take that last quick email check, and we'll be back with you in about 1 minute. Well, I think we've waited long enough. Why don't we get started? Welcome, everybody. My name is Nick Astor. I'm the head of marketing for North America for South Pole. Just a little bit of background about who we are in case you don't know. We're a full-service decarbonization consultancy based in Zurich, Switzerland, but with big operations here in the United States as well. We've been around for about 16 years and one of the better known sustainability consultancies out there in the world in general. We're also very well known as a carbon projects developer around the world. We have one of the largest portfolios of anybody out there and operations in about 35 countries today. And as I mentioned, we have a group's big and growing presence here in the US and Canada. Which includes not just a basic decarbonization strategy, but an increasing amount of expertise on some very specific areas. And so today's webinar, we're going to focus on CORSIA. You're probably here because you've at least heard of it and are at least beginning to be familiar with it and what it means to not just the aviation industry, but the carbon markets in general. We've got a couple of terrific experts here who are going to kick us off. And if I can get the slides going in the right direction here. Emily Waffler is here. She's our Climate Action Credit Advisory Lead. Luke Sherman as well. He's our Climate Policy, Finance, and Carbon Markets Consultant. They both know an awful lot about CORSIA. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the basics, and then we're going to get nice and technical so that we can answer a whole lot of your questions. We're probably going to aim at about 30 minutes to roll through this webinar, which is going to leave us plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So if you do have questions, by now you probably have this figured out, but there's a little box on the side of your screen that says questions. Simply type in your questions at any time. We'll queue those questions up, and I will ask those questions of Emily and Luke at the end of the webinar. So ask them anytime. We'll get them answered at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Luke. Luke, you ready? Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
All right.
Thanks, Nick, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. I'm really excited to walk you through some of the most important updates as it pertains to CORSIA. And before doing so, I think it'd be useful just to give a quick overview of the scheme. So CORSIA stands for the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It is a scheme that was launched in 2016 by the International Civil Aviation Organization. And ICAO, as it is known, is a specialized agency of the United Nations. CORSIA is notable because it's the first mandatory sector-specific compliance carbon pricing scheme, and it's expected to drive significant demand from regulated airlines as well as other actors for carbon offsets. The goal of CORSIA is to achieve carbon neutral growth of the international aviation sector from 2020 onward. The scheme is divided into 3 phases, with the first 2 phases being voluntary in nature from the perspective of national member states, which I can explain in a moment, that nuance, and becomes mandatory in the second phase, which begins in 2027. The scheme has a 15-year duration with a possibility of extension beyond its current 2035 end date. By the end of 2032, ICAO will conduct a review of the functioning of the scheme, its success in ensuring the carbon neutral growth of the international aviation sector, and determine if the scheme should be terminated at its 2035 end date, extended as is, or prolonged beyond 2035 with modifications. So we currently find ourselves in the pilot phase of CORSIA, which runs through December 31st of this year, with the first phase beginning immediately thereafter and running through 2026. As I mentioned, the pilot and first phases are voluntary, but from the perspective of individual ICAO member states. So airplane operators that are operating or flying routes between states that have voluntarily opted into CORSIA do not have the choice of choosing to participate in CORSIA's offsetting obligations, but instead must do so. Compliance and participation with CORSIA becomes mandatory, as I mentioned, in the second phase, which begins in 2027. Most flights are covered by CORSIA. There are a few exemptions, specifically flights that are carried out for humanitarian, medical, or firefighting operations between states that volunteer to participate in the pilot and first phases. And in the second phase, almost all flights are covered with those same exemptions that I just mentioned between nearly every single country in the world. There are some exemptions that are worth noting, including exemptions for least developed countries, small island developing states, and landlocked developing countries. These countries are exempt from all phases of CORSIA unless they volunteer to participate in the scheme. And it is worth noting that several of these states have already opted to do so. The baseline that was determined or used to determine whether or not the international aviation sector is indeed achieving carbon neutral growth was originally going to be the average of the sector's 2019 and 2020 CO2 emissions. But due to the emergence and spread globally of COVID-19 and airlines lobbying for that baseline to be modified, in June 2020, the ICAO Council announced that the sector's 2019 CO2 emissions level would serve as the baseline for the pilot phase. And this meant, because of a collapse in international air traffic, that there has been limited compliance obligations on the sector for the pilot phase. But this baseline determination will change for the future phases of CORSIA. So beginning in 2024 with the first phase, the scheme's baseline will equal 85% of the sector's 2019 CO2 emissions. And due to that lowering of the baseline and the increase in international air traffic due to a resurgence in recession in COVID-19, we do expect there to be significant demand for carbon offsets to emerge for the first phase. If you could please go to the next slide, Nick. So as we know, as I mentioned, the international aviation sector has this goal now imposed upon it of carbon neutral growth from 2020 onward. And there are several means that have been identified for the sector to actually accomplish that goal. So to comply with CORSIA, the international aviation sector has several options that it can make use of. And these are referred to in ICAO parlance as a basket of measures. So some of them are improved fuel efficiency and engine efficiency, as well as lighter aircraft, and thereby requiring less fuel burn, improved ground operations and air traffic control, and improved use of fuel more broadly, as well as improved and increased consumption of alternatives to conventional aviation fuel. These are referred to as sustainable aviation fuels and can derive from a variety of feedstocks. But a very large percentage of this goal is expected to be met via the purchase of CORSIA eligible offsets. And this graph here shows the difference in percentage of levers that the sector is expected to make use of in order to achieve that carbon neutral growth goal. If you could go to the next slide, Nick, that would be great. So in terms of determining which credits are actually eligible to be surrendered for compliance with CORSIA, as I mentioned, the program administrator is a UN specialized agency called the International Civil Aviation Organization, which comprises 193 member states. Essentially every single UN member state is a member of ICAO. And the ultimate decision-making authority for CORSIA, for the credits that are deemed eligible to be surrendered for compliance with CORSIA, rests with a smaller body called the ICAO Council. And this is a body that comprises 36 member states within that broader 193 member state number. The ICAO Council relies on an entity that is called the Technical Advisory Body for advice on the implementation of CORSIA. And the Technical Advisory Body, or TAB as it is known, provides on a regular basis advice to the ICAO Council for all implementation elements of the scheme. And throughout 2023, the TAB has been reviewing which units that were already deemed eligible to be surrendered for compliance with the pilot phase should be eligible to be surrendered for compliance with the first phase as well. And as I mentioned in a previous slide, the first phase begins on January 1st, 2024. At the end of March, the TAB's recommendations of those existing units that have been deemed eligible to be surrendered for compliance was made public. And the ICAO Council adopted those recommendations, which my colleague will explain in further detail in a few minutes. And throughout the rest of 2023, specifically Q2 and Q3, the TAB will be reviewing applications for new units that are not already eligible to be surrendered for compliance with CORSIA and their eligibility for to be surrendered for compliance with the first phase. The Technical Advisory Body will be making its recommendations at the end of Q3, and the ICAO Council will formally review the TAB's recommendations about these credits and the eligibility of these credits to be surrendered for compliance in the fall. And thus far, we have only had 2 standards that have been deemed eligible to be surrendered for compliance with the first phase, which my colleague will explain in greater detail momentarily. If you could go to the next slide, Nick, that would be fantastic. Thank you. One previous, I believe. Thank you. It's important to note the interaction between CORSIA and the Paris Agreement, and I can explain further now. For the pilot phase of CORSIA, the eligible emission units are able to derive from emission units that were generated on or after January 1st, 2016. But thus far, for the first phase, ICAO Council has decided for now that only emission units derived from post-2021 emission reductions are eligible to be surrendered for compliance. And the reason why this is relevant is because under the Paris Agreement, all emission reductions that are used for the purpose of achieving compliance with a country's Paris Agreement pledge or for the purpose of achieving compliance with CORSIA that are generated on or after 2021 must be associated with something called a corresponding adjustment. So in the context of the Paris Agreement, corresponding adjustments refer to countries' agreement to transfer mitigation outcomes, known in Paris Agreement parlance as internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs, to other parties. And as a result, in order to safeguard the environmental integrity of the Paris Agreement, to subtract the mitigation outcomes from their own GHG emission inventories. So as we see in this graph here, in a transaction for these mitigation outcomes between a country where a carbon project generating a CORSIA eligible credit is being generated and an airline that is purchasing that credit for the purpose of achieving compliance with CORSIA are able to adjust their emissions inventories accordingly. So this is relevant because these credits are are correspondingly adjusted are not expected to hit the market in significant volumes for quite some time. We don't expect there to be any meaningful numbers of these correspondingly adjusted credits until next year at the earliest. And so it's important for any buyers of offsets for the use for the purpose of achieving compliance with CORSIA are aware of this requirement and are adjusting their purchasing strategy accordingly. And it's important to note and to stress that corresponding adjustments must be executed for only post-2020 emission reductions and removals. So as I mentioned earlier, any emission reductions or removals that are generated before 2021 are not required to be accompanied by a corresponding adjustment, as that's because before 2021, the accounting phase of the Paris Agreement did not exist. The Paris Agreement succeeded an international environmental treaty called the Kyoto Protocol that ended at the end of 2020. I'll pass it over to my colleague Emily to walk you through some more information about CORSIA.
Excellent, thanks, Luke. Really appreciate that background. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So really, we want to get into this in the second phase of this webinar, is building off of the great history and context that Luke's just offered on how to meaningfully respond to everything that has been happening with CORSIA and everything that we expect to happen. So as Luke previewed, TAB has been reviewing eligible emission units from the pilot phase for applicability under the first upcoming phase of CORSIA. So far, as part of this process, they've reviewed all of those units that were previously approved under the pilot phase and have made some initial recommendations. Those include a full acceptance of all methodologies published under the American Carbon Registry and all methodologies under the Architecture for RED+ transactions. There are also a host of standards that have been conditionally accepted, which means that only some methodologies under these standards will be applicable under the first phase. Those include the Climate Action Reserve, the Global Carbon Council, the Voluntary Carbon Standard, and Gold Standard. It should also be noted that CDM was available and approved under the pilot phase, but it did not submit for reapproval under the first phase. And as Luke previewed as well, all projects under the first phase of CORSIA must have the crediting period on or after January 2016. And again, that is to reflect the need for corresponding adjustments and adjusting to the Paris Agreement. Now, so that's what's already been announced. And again, this is just initial recommendations from TAB. They are not finalized. That said, looking forward to this fall, we are expecting ICAO Council to formally approve and make their recommendations based on TAB's recommendations. So at that point, we will know whether or not these initial recommendations have been approved by ICAO Council. That said, it is very likely that ICAO will accept these. At least that's our point of view at South Pole. They have been ready to accept TAB's recommendations previously. So we have no reason to believe that these recommendations won't be part of phase one. The other thing that will be happening this fall is that ICAO will be making formal announcements regarding any credits that were not previously in the pilot phase that submitted for approval and eligibility under the first phase. So currently, as we're speaking, TAB is reviewing a number of standards that have been submitted to the council for approval under this first phase. So that will also be happening this fall. So two really key things to keep an eye out for. So the big thing to take away from all of these announcements and recommendations and review processes is to really understand and be aware of the implications for purchasing and for the market. We'll talk a little bit more about it here, but the key things to note is that we already know a little bit what's to be expected under phase one. Those are the standards that have already gone through the review process with TAB, but also being aware of that there are other standards that might also be under the first phase, and there is a public record of which ones have submitted, so something all to keep an eye out on moving forward. If we can go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what we can expect in the market. So in the short term, what is very likely is that we are going to see an increase in demand for CORSIA credits. And this is not just coming from airlines, and this is something very important to note. We saw this in the pilot phase, that these eligible emissions units under CORSIA received a lot of demand across industries. And the reason being is that when a big entity like ICAO comes out and says, hey, we think these are the credits that we want to have under our program, that sends a signal to the voluntary market that, okay, these may be of higher quality, they may look better publicly, they just get a lot more attention than credits that aren't eligible under this program. So what happened in the pilot phase is that there was a big spike in interest in these credits, and prices adjust accordingly because this demand is going up. That said, and again, we really want to reiterate this, these recommendations, again, require that corresponding adjustment. Those types of credits are not currently on the market. We don't expect them to be on the market at least until next year. So if someone's out there saying, you know, come buy a phase one credit today, those corresponding adjustment credits are not on the market. So there might need to be a longer discussion about what that actually means. If they're referencing an actual pilot phase CORSIA credit, of course, pilot phase credits are still available on the market, but really these first phase credits with that corresponding adjustment, they're not available at the moment. Of course, there's a lot of ways to strategize, be prepared for that first phase, start thinking about ways to structure and procure those first phase credits, but they're not there right now. And we'll talk about those strategies in the next slide, but just something to be aware of, especially in the short term. Now, in the medium term, of course, these credits, oh, sorry, previous slide still. Of course, in the medium term, these correspondingly adjusted credits will eventually become available on the market. Again, not expected until next year. And as such, demand for those correspondingly adjusted credits are probably going to spike. So we're going to see a lot more demand and a lot more price increases on those corresponding adjustment credits. And of course, that's going to, the demand for the pilot phase credits, those are going to respond accordingly. Of course, pilot phase reporting, that's going to happen in January, as Luke mentioned, because of a lot of the baselining issues and COVID-related flight demand. There's less of a need to purchase under the pilot phase. Of course, lots of airlines are buying voluntarily, lots of non-airlines are buying CORSIA credits voluntarily, but just something to be aware of when we're thinking more medium term in the next year or so. And then, of course, long term. Now, as Luke mentioned, there is voluntary participation for the forthcoming years, but that's only voluntary on a country level. Of course, airlines that operate between participating countries will have to comply. And then by 2027, all ICAO members will then have to be compliant with CORSIA. So when we think long-term, 2027 is that date when all member countries, all of the airlines and all the airlines flying between member countries are going to be required to comply with CORSIA. And that's really where you're going to see the market be tested for these credits. Of course, that's a little bit of a ways away. There's going to be a lot of shift in demand, not just from airlines for CORSIA credits, but from other entities that are interested in CORSIA credits. The market could grow. So there's a lot going on there, but just something to be aware of is that that 2027 deadline, that's when there's going to be a bigger need for purchasing these credits, because that's when all of the members are now going to be responsible for responding. Next slide, please. So strategy. Oh, sorry, next one. So strategy, what should entities, specifically airlines, do to navigate all of this, how to make sense of it, and how to be really thoughtful about it, given the fact that we know demand is coming and it's coming quickly for both pilot phase CORSIA credits and phase one credits. So, of course, let's start with adapting to market demand and thinking about these pilot phase credits. So again, these are these non-correspondingly adjusted credits. These were credits already approved of under the pilot phase. So, of course, as you mentioned, the baseline, with the given baseline and all the adjustments to flight demand under COVID, it is voluntary to purchase credits. Of course, a lot of airlines are purchasing these credits. And of course, non-airlines are purchasing these credits. So in order to make sure that entities that want to secure these CORSIA credits are able to do so, we recommend doing some sort of fill order or working with credit retailers and developers to secure credits in a way that is saying on a blanket basis, we want CORSIA credits, and making sure that you're purchasing them in advance so when they hit the market, you're able to have that guarantee. Especially given all the market swings that we're expecting to see with CORSIA, it's best to kind of get those orders in early and making sure that if CORSIA credits are a part of your strategy for those pilot phase credits, that you have a method and strategy for doing so early. And again, can't iterate this enough, phase one credits are not currently available on the market. That said, there's a lot to be done in advance of when those credits can become available to make sure that your entity is ready and able to purchase their credits. And first and foremost, always the number one step is to educate internal stakeholders. Because this is such a nuanced and complicated topic, educating stakeholders internally at an organization is so helpful, so that when it comes time to purchase credits, everyone knows when to move, how to move, and what it all means. And of course, there's also a lot more work you can do regarding building a carbon strategy, even for these phase one credits that are not on the market. We'll talk a little bit about this in the next stage, but thinking about forecasting your amount of emissions, potential reductions, but also thinking about what kind of credits are you interested in. Again, we mentioned a long list of different standards that we are either accepted or conditionally accepted under the first phase, or are likely to be accepted under the first phase. And of course, there's other standards that are being considered for the first phase as well. Different entities may have different preferences about which of those standards they'd like to purchase, and that could be for a variety of reasons, right? You know, credits under each of these standards, they differ in terms of project type, managers, different risks and co-benefits. So working with your stakeholders to align on what is really valuable for our organization. We know we want to buy CORSIA, but the conversation doesn't stop there. What CORSIA credits do we want to buy? How far in advance do we want to buy? What are our budgetary concerns? You know, are we comfortable buying in a fill order? What would that look like? How would we structure that? And when we're comfortable making these decisions, and you know, how often we want to review these things. These are all questions that it's best to address and navigate early on. And again, this is because we're going to see lots of big swings and drives for demand in the market. Being ahead and having your ducks in a row before the market starts acting up is the best way to make sure that you're purchasing, but you're purchasing well, you're purchasing smartly, and you're making the most of what the market has to offer. Of course, at South Pole, we offer a lot of services on this, so always feel free to reach out to us regarding educational workshops or strategy development. This is what Luke and I spend a lot of time working on and discussing, so happy to have those conversations. But either way, again, education and just starting the conversation as early as possible before all these formal announcements come out and before the market starts getting really interested in CORSIA units is always going to help make sure that your strategy is well ahead of any expected spikes. The next part would be planning for reductions. Oh, sorry. Go back. The next key thing would be to plan for reductions. So of course, buying CORSIA credits are just one piece of a much larger decarbonization pathway. And of course, here at South Pole, we're very excited about a lot of these efforts. So the first is ongoing efficiency measures. Luke mentioned them at the top of the call. Those are lighter airframes, more efficient engines. When planning for how many credits you're going to need to purchase, understanding when those efficiency measures are going to be implemented will be really key to making sure that you have accurate forecasting for your credit needs. also a big part of this is going to be SAF or sustainable aviation fuels. Of course, right now SAF is very expensive and it's not widely available. However, over time, we are hoping and expecting to see perhaps the price of SAF go down, and then alternatively, maybe credit prices go up. So understanding these shifts in demand will be really helpful, not only from a decarbonization perspective, but also a financial perspective, understanding what is the most cost-effective way to obviously meet customer needs in terms of airline operations, but also meeting carbon goals and understanding how to effectively do that over a long term when we're seeing a lot of this innovation in the fuel sector, but also in the carbon markets. We're also expecting to see a lot of changes there too. So understanding how both of those factors will play out will enable you to model expected shifts in demand. And then lastly, minding any changes in eligibility and routes. As we said, it's not until 2027 that ICAO members are going to be required to be compliant under CORSIA, but of course, in these earlier phases, participation is voluntary. So as different countries say that, yes, we're volunteering, that's going to change what routes are going to be eligible under CORSIA. That's going to, of course, then affect how many emissions need to be addressed with credits if more routes are going to be added under CORSIA because of all these other members volunteering. Of course, it goes both ways. If an airline adds a new route to a country that is already a member and is already participating, then making sure that those emissions are properly accounting for, and then of course building systems to monitor this on an ongoing basis. This is going to be a reality for a long time, so developing systems internally to track, communicate, respond, and then of course update any CORSIA strategies accordingly will be essential. I'll pause there. Thank you so much for joining us and listening, and we would like to open the floor to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you so much, Luke. I'm pulling up the questions here. We have a number of questions that have already come in. If you have some that you haven't asked yet, please use that little question box that you should see on the side of your screen. What do we have here? All right. First question. This sounds like a good, straightforward one, specifically coming from airlines. Of all the recommended responses you've gone through, give me the top 3 things airlines should be doing now to respond to CORSIA.
Definitely. I can kick this off, and then Luke, feel free to jump in as necessary. I think first and foremost is communicating and educating internally. Again, this is a really complicated topic, understanding the difference between a pilot and a first phase, between the different standards that are eligible, the timeline for all of that. Just making sure that key stakeholders and decision makers are on the same page will put you honestly leagues ahead and help you navigate internally. And then the second is what I would just call identifying priorities, which would be understanding, okay, we have CORSIA, we know we're going to have to respond. What is our volume? First and foremost, how much are we going to need to purchase? What are our priorities here? Are we, standard agnostic? We're willing to take any CORSIA standard. Are we wanting to be more savvy about, financial structuring and budgeting and trying to play the market to get, the most cost-effective portfolio? Are there certain, project types that we really want to have in our portfolio? Risks that we want to avoid? All of these different conversations, sitting down and saying, okay, we know we're going to respond to this. What are the key things that we want to do to be able to respond? That is step one. And then from there, we can talk bigger strategies, developing more formal, roadmaps, all of those things. But without that key initial step, you have nowhere to go. And then the last is developing a system. So this isn't stagnant. This is a multi-year journey for all airlines. So thinking about, okay, even if we're only in year 1 of our strategy or roadmap development, what are our team structures going to look like? What is our process for checking updates and communicating them internally and making sure that you can continue to operationalize this for years to come? So those are the 3 things. First, education. Second, setting priorities. And third, developing systems for ongoing maintenance. Thanks.
I would just chime in. I would echo Emily's point that while we haven't seen very much compliance obligations under CORSIA for the pilot phase due to, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, the decision to use solely the sector's 2019 emissions level as the baseline for that phase, we do expect there to be significant compliance obligations for CORSIA in the first and second phases, so beginning from next year onward. The International Civil Aviation Organization's Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection has modeled what it thinks based on various scenarios the total compensation obligations will be for the sector in order to achieve compliance with CORSIA. And their estimates are ranging from 600 million to 2.1 billion metric tons of offsets will need to be purchased to achieve the goal of CORSIA of carbon neutral growth between 2024 and 2035. So the offsetting obligations are expected to be quite large. They do depend, of course, on, as Emily was mentioning, the availability of sustainable aviation fuels, different countries' decision to participate in CORSIA before the mandatory phase kicks in 2027, as well as a number of modifications to engine performance and aircraft technology. So I would echo her point that it is critical that given this large offsetting obligation projected for the sector, that airlines are getting ready for participation in the scheme moving forward.
Terrific, thanks, Luke. All right, another question. And you may have got into this a little bit earlier, Emily, in your section. I think you said that we can currently buy pilot phase credits, but can I buy phase 1 credits now?
I can take this one. So pilot phase credits are currently available, or pilot phase eligible credits are currently available on the carbon market. So as I was mentioning, various standards have been deemed eligible to supply credits for the pilot phase of CORSIA. And these eligible unit dates, or essentially vintages, are able to be generated from 2016 onward. But for the first phase of CORSIA, at least as of now, the ICAO Council has decided that only post-2020 emission reduction units or emission removal units will be able to be surrendered for compliance with CORSIA. That could change, of course, as you know, it is a regulated scheme, so it is subject to the regulators' decisions and the governments that comprise ICAO's decisions. But at least at the moment, we know we can only base our decisions on what has been decided thus far and communicated by ICAO. While there are post-2020 emission reduction units being generated on the market, there are no correspondingly adjusted credits on the market. And all post-2020 offsets used for the purpose of achieving compliance with CORSIA are required to be associated with a corresponding adjustment per the Paris Agreement and international climate policy negotiations.
All right, let's see what else we got here. So who ensures that airplane operators comply? And I suppose, what are the consequences if they don't?
Thanks, Nick. I can take this one as well. So for the period of, well, for really all of CORSIA, while it is administered by ICAO, the ultimate enforcing entity and entity that ensures compliance with CORSIA is executed at the ICAO member state level. So in an American context, for all airlines that are US based and are subject to CORSIA compliance, the FAA is the entity that ensures compliance with CORSIA, and the FAA equivalent for other countries that are participating in CORSIA is the one that ensures compliance for their airlines. There are civil and monetary penalties for non-compliance with CORSIA, and this is, of course, necessary to ensure that all member states are properly implementing CORSIA and to safeguard the environmental integrity and fairness of the scheme.
Excellent. A question on SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. I don't know if I would phrase it like this, but how does the use of SAF, the question is, can SAF become CORSIA eligible credits? I'm not totally sure I understand the question completely, but I'm thinking it means how does a SAF strategy couple with a credit strategy in terms of your CORSIA compliance?
Emily, do you want to take it?
I'll take a stab and then feel free to fill in the gaps. So when we think about incorporating SAF into a strategy, right, really where the carbon emissions benefits are going to come is going to come in the form of a reduction in your footprint, right? So overall, the amount of emissions being generated will be reduced the more SAF is incorporated into operations. That said, that can't be then turned around and generated into a credit and sold on the market, right? It's going to be incorporated into the actual reductions, and then the remaining amount of emissions after that reduction will then be addressed with CORSIA credits. Where it gets really interesting, of course, is the financials of it all. Of course, SAF is very expensive right now. So as those prices goes down, maybe, CORSIA units, those prices go up, maybe they hit a similar point, right? That's going to really influence strategy and uptake of what we hope is a lot more sustainable aviation fuel. Of course, that's always the #1 recommended approach to decarbonization is those reductions. So that's something that we're eager to see. But Luke, anything else I'm missing or any other context you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I would echo exactly what you're saying. I mean, here at South Pole, I mean, we want a decarbonized world, and we want alternatives to conventional jet fuel to be, widely available and price competitive on the market. Unfortunately, at present, the total fuel consumed by the aviation sector, alternatives to jet fuel, sustainable aviation fuels, comprises less than 0.5% of that fuel. And that's largely because SAF on average is between 2 and 4 times more expensive than conventional aviation fuel, depending on the underlying feedstock and production location of the alternative to jet fuel. And in terms of understanding how the use of SAF reduces offsetting obligations under CORSIA, each fuel consumed by an airline, including conventional aviation fuel, is assigned a greenhouse gas emissions intensity. So the emission reductions from the use of alternatives to jet fuels, referred to in ICAO parlance as CORSIA eligible fuels, each of these volumes of fuels that are consumed in a given year are based on these fuels' life cycle emission values from their harvesting and production all the way through their ultimate burn in an engine. And so these life cycle emission values depends on the fuel's feedstock, their conversion process, and the region in which they are produced. And there are 2 possibilities to obtain these life cycle emission values of CORSIA eligible fuels. Essentially a default life cycle emission value for CORSIA eligible fuels, or an actual life cycle emission value where the user of that fuel actually demonstrates why its emissions intensity of its sustainable aviation fuel is lower than what the default value provided by ICAO is. And in the case in which an operator wants to claim a lower greenhouse gas emissions intensity than the default value, an approved sustainability certification scheme has to ensure that the methodology has been applied correctly. And South Pole can really, help our partners in the aviation sector understand, these processes in greater detail, and would welcome the opportunity to collaborate in this regard.
Excellent, thank you, Luke. Okay, couple more questions here. Don't hold back if you got additional questions, throw them in that box there. Walk us through the process by which an airplane operator would calculate their offsetting requirements.
So airplane operators' offsetting requirements are calculated somewhat oddly under CORSIA. So for the period between 2021 through 2032, so this comprises the pilot phase of CORSIA, the first phase of CORSIA, and the first 2/3 of the second phase of CORSIA. 100% of airplane operators' offsetting requirements is based on the international aviation sector's global average growth of CO2 emissions in a given year. But for the period 2033 through 2035, the offsetting obligations calculation is a mixture of that global average growth of the sector and the individual airplane operators' growth factor of CO2 emissions in the given year. It is still weighted heavily in the sector's average growth factor. So 85% of the offsetting obligations would be calculated based on the sector's growth and 15% on the individual operator's growth. And for those who are wondering what happens beyond 2035, as I mentioned, CORSIA at present lasts exclusively through 2035. By the end of 2032, ICAO will make the decision about whether or not CORSIA should be extended beyond its current 2035 end date.
Excellent, thank you, Luke. We got one more question here. Speaking of decisions on the future of CORSIA, are there provisions that would allow for adjustments to the agreement in the event that it was decided that they needed to happen?
Yes, and this was done at member states' urging. So the ICAO Council conducts a review of the implementation of CORSIA every 3 years, with the first review having been conducted last year in 2022. So these reviews include an assessment of CORSIA on the growth of the international aviation sector. So how is CORSIA impacting the sector's financial viability? And they serve as an important basis for the Council to consider adjustments on the scheme and make recommendations to the broader ICAO Assembly, which comprises those 193 UN member states, for decisions about the next phase, future phases of CORSIA. And as I mentioned, a special additional review will be performed by the end of 2032 to determine if the scheme should be terminated, extended unchanged, or extended with modifications beyond its current 2035 end date.
Thanks a lot. With that, unless anybody jumps in and raises their hand, I think we can call it a wrap. It's just about the time we were hoping to wrap anyway. So I think we did a terrific job with that, and I want to thank both Emily and Luke for taking the time to join us today and get into some of these real nitty-gritty details. Contact information is on the screen. Both Emily and Luke would be more than happy to receive your emails. There's also plenty more information available on our website at southpole.com. This webinar is one that is a little bit more technical on the subject of CORSIA, but we have a whole series of webinars coming up on renewable energy, on different applications for carbon credits and more. All of that is available on the website as well if you simply go to the events tab. Please check it out, and thanks so much for coming. And as I noted, please don't hesitate to get in touch should you have additional questions. Thank you, Emily and Luke.
Yes, thank you. As always, feel free, like Nick said, to reach out, and we're happy to chat about this. We do workshops. We work with lots of clients in strategy, so I'm always looking forward to connecting. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. All right, guys. Since I'm such an expert, I've lost my screen to turn it off. Yeah,
great.
Good.
All right. Well, thanks, Nick. I will log out.
Thanks, everybody. All right.